And we're going to be in Ephesians chapter 6. Ephesians chapter 6. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 9 when we get there in a moment. Ephesians chapter 6. As you're kind of finding your way there, I'd like to ask you if you could relive your childhood, would you change the way that you acted towards your parents, or would you change the way that they treated you? If you could only pick one, we probably, would want to go with both maybe at times, but just thinking generally, would you change the way that you acted towards your parents, or would you change the way that they treated or acted towards you?
I think that I would change the way that I acted toward them. I don't think I would be quite as rebellious.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, I think I'd probably be in the same boat as well. I think I would change the way I acted. What about others? Anybody else?
I would have probably been on medication.
Okay.
I was a little hyper as a kid, evidently.
Okay.
And then, nowadays they give you something to kind of calm you down, but probably drove my parents nuts. So I wasn't mean to them. I just was too full of life.
Right. So maybe change, if you could relive it, maybe change the way you responded. Take some medication. All right, so when you think about obedience, think about that word, think about the concept. What comes to mind? What comes to mind when you think about obedience?
Obeying,
all right, yeah. That's kind of combined right in with the word, right?
Yeah.
Obedience, obey. What else? Yeah. What else comes to mind when you think about the word obedience? Do you think? Let's ask this question here. Do you think about obedience as a positive or a negative? What do you think when you hear that word, either obedience or obey?
Well, it depends.
Okay.
It depends on who you're obeying, because there can certainly be people that would lead you astray. And ideally, your parents would not. But I think in general, if we're talking about a relatively wholesome family, then obedience is a good thing.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So maybe it depends on the situation and who we're talking about being obedient to. So that would all factor in there. So maybe a positive and maybe a negative, depends. Anybody else want to chime in? What do you think of when you think of the word and the concept of obedience? What comes to your mind?
Doing what you're supposed to do is what I think.
Okay.
I think of it positively.
Okay, yeah. So thinking of it positively, doing what you're supposed to do, that comes to mind. Sure. All right, let's take a look at Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 9. And I'm going to ask somebody who does not have congestion if they would mind reading. Can I get a volunteer who would like to read? Don't be afraid. It's not as long as it has been in the past weeks.
Yeah, I can do it.
Okay, all right, very good. So Ephesians chapter 6, 1 through 9.
Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Here, I'll read. Okay, it looks like it's the same thing. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment, with promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ, not by the way of the eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. Masters, do the same to them and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. Is that through 9?
No, that's it. Yep, you got it. Good.
Okay.
All right. So, how is obedience to parents a part of a child's obligation according to this text? In what way or how?
Well, I think doing what your parents expect you to do, or if they tell you to do something, the obedience comes there in you doing it. Many times children do things they don't want to do, but need to do. Does that make any sense?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
What is it connected to? What when Paul talks? Go ahead.
He anchors it with one of the 10 commandments. He says this is the first commandment with the promise: honor your father and mother.
Sure, absolutely. So he anchors it in the Old Testament commandments that were given by God, and of course, all that's connected to the Lord, right? Verse 1: children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. So we had talked before. And this is always going to come up because this is always important. Now, he's obviously talking to Christians. He's talking to Christian homes, parents, all of that kind of stuff. Everything that we do ought to be anchored in, as was mentioned, it should be connected to Christ. It should be connected to the Lord, right? So everything that we do, the reason behind it, in a sense, the motivation behind it is always connected to Christ. And that's important. And we've talked before about whether it's husbands and wives or it doesn't matter what it is. If it's not connected to Christ, then it becomes very easy for us to not do or act a way that we're supposed to act because that other person's not acting the way that they're supposed to act or something along those lines. And so it becomes, you do this and I'll do that. And if you don't do this, I won't do that. If you don't act right, I won't act right. Those kinds of things. And when it's connected to Christ, it doesn't matter how the other person acts. What does matter is our role, personally, you're looking at yourself kind of thing. So it's always anchored in the Lord. And Paul does that here. He anchors that in Christ. Now, as Tim mentioned, it's anchored to Exodus chapter 20 and verse 12. God's commandment was that the children should honor your father and your mother. And again, we find Paul quoting that here in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 2. And so we want to ask the question, what do you think the word honor means? It's not the same thing as obedience, is it?
I think there's more to it than obedience. I think obedience is just a part of it.
Okay. Yeah. So honor and obedience are not actually the same thing, right? So you're saying there's more to it than just obedience. So there's honor. So what does the word honor mean? When you think about that, it's got to be more than simply obedience. But what do you think of when you think of the word honor? What do you think God was meaning when he said honor your father and your mother? What does honor mean?
I think of it as the obedience part when we're younger at home under the influence of our parents, and honor comes in as we continue into adulthood, taking care of our parents and seeing after them when they're not able, that honoring them is, respecting them and helping with them and taking care of them, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Taking care of them. That's right. Anybody else? What comes to mind? What do you think of the word honor? Would you think of the concept of something that's highly prized, valued in some way?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, somebody gives you an honor at work. You know, they're saying that we appreciate you, right? There's some kind of value there. We respect you. We value you. There's
Right.
something like that.
Lifts them up as something special.
Something special. Absolutely. Absolutely. Something you hold up, right? You have high regard for it. Something that you consider, again, valuable in some way. And so God is saying children need to not simply obey, that's there, but then I think it was you, Kimberly, who said honor is more than obedience. Of course, it wouldn't be less than. There's got to be some combination in there, but it's more than that. It's beyond simply, okay, I'll do what you say, kind of grudgingly, but having some kind of a reverence. And this happens with God as well, right? We're told to hold God in high regard, to revere him, to honor him, right? Now, obviously, we don't honor our parents in the same way that we honor God, but there's some kind of a connection that goes on there. We hold God in high esteem. We hold him valuable, all of those kinds of things. And so it's more than just obedience because, well, let me ask you this. Could a child, whether they're a young child or even an older adult child, could a child show obedience to their parents and yet not hold them in honor?
Yes.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you can obey.
Obedience just means that you do what they say.
Right. Yeah, you can do that. But that doesn't mean that you hold them in high respect. You can do things, grudgingly, right?
Right.
Can you think of an example? One comes to my mind, but can you think of a biblical example in the New Testament when Jesus is walking around and he rebukes certain people for not honoring their parents? Remember the situation, the issue?
It had something to do, didn't it, where they gave money to the temple and said it was a gift?
That's right. Instead of taking care.
Instead of what they would do for their parents.
Absolutely. That's right. So instead of taking care of your aging parents, which was the duty of children in the ancient world, should be the duty of children, adult children in the modern world, at least those who are in Christ. But in the ancient world, in Judaism, the parents were, again, they were meant to be honored and they were meant to be taken care of. They didn't have the kind of system that we have in modern America today, where you've got government help, or you store away, for retirement. A lot of people were not necessarily very wealthy and couldn't store away much, if anything, for retirement. They depended on their children, and so Jesus rebukes these people because what they did was, they said, we know how we're going to get around this. We're not going to have to take care of our parents. They're a financial burden on us. So what we're going to say is, I'd love to help you. But everything I have has been devoted to God. Isn't that a wonderful way to get around doing what you're supposed to do, that God calls you to do? We would never do something like that in our day and age, right? We as Christians would never use some kind of spiritual sounding thing to get around what God has called us to do, right? Yeah. I mean, that's what they were doing. They were doing that kind of thing. So they were pretending to be, and really they were pretending to be spiritual and saying everything we have is devoted to God, so we can't help you. That's clearly not honoring their parents. And Jesus rebukes them for that kind of thing. All right, so what did God promise children when they obeyed their parents in verses 2 and 3? This is the Old Testament, but what was the promise?
On earth.
Yeah. They might have a long life on earth.
Okay, they were going to have a long life. What else? Was there something else that goes along with that?
Verse 3.
That it may go well with you, right?
The,
And that you may live long in the land. So there was two parts to that. You could live long in the land and things not go well, right? They're not necessarily hand in hand. So the promise was that things would go well with you and that you would live long in the land. Now, obviously, that's the Old Testament passage that Paul quotes there. So how does God's commandment and promise to children hold true for today? I mean, we don't have a land promise that they had in the Old Testament. So Paul quotes it for a reason. He utilizes it for a reason. So how does God's command and promise to children hold true for us today?
well, I don't think things have changed about honoring your father and mother. And I think the same thing would be expected of children today.
Absolutely, that's right. Absolutely true. Now, is what happens with the promise? Is there a promise that holds true for children today?
Well, it'd be like for anyone that's been baptized that if you follow what the Bible tells you what to do, that you have the promise of having eternal life in heaven. I don't know.
Yeah,
That's grassy
sure.
or not.
Yeah, there's promise. Now, their promised land was a physical land.
Right.
Now, our promised land is bigger than that. It's different than what that was. But is there, and you were kind of answering this, is there blessings when we follow God's commands? Are there blessings that we see even here and now? Before we get to glory, do we receive any kind of blessing from obeying God?
Well, I see that. You can see that out at the nursing home with people out there with their parents. You can tell people that are really cared for, and you can tell that there's a reward because of the way they're responding from their mother and their dad, especially their mother out there, because I think their dads are gone, most of them. But you can see that, with Christians and non-Christians, that it really makes a difference to be honoring your parents.
Absolutely. And the reality is there's always blessings. When we obey God, there are always blessings. Now, it may not be what we want or what we think we should get as a blessing. Sometimes it's not even things that are tangible or visible, but yet there are still blessings here and now for doing what God has called us to do. In fact, if we think about younger children who are obeying their parents, there's always blessings that come from being obedient to your parents. A lot of times you don't get into the trouble that you could have gotten into if you would just simply have listened to your parents.
Hey, brother.
Hey, good evening.
Like,
You got something
like-
to say? Go for it.
Like most things that God does, there's a wide periphery around it. So he blesses us when we do the things that he wants us to do. We remain steadfast. We persevere through the trials of life. But there are other Christians and people that are blessed by our presence and by God's blessings to us. And they may not realize it, and we may not even realize it, but God always does things in abundance. It's always more than just blessing us individually.
Yeah, that's a great point. Anytime, and we are blessed, right, in different ways, and the blessings, as our brother Larry has said, it goes out beyond us. When God blesses an individual, it's not just for the individual. It's meant to flow into the lives of other people, other Christians, even non-Christians, as they come into contact with Christians. There's blessings that kind of overflow into their lives. There's influence and impact and things of that nature that other people receive. So very good point. Very good point. If you think back when you were younger, how did honoring your parents bring blessings to you? You think back when you were younger, maybe in the house of your parents, when you did honor and respect and obey, what kind of blessings did you receive?
It's the general reward consequence type thing. You do what you are supposed to do, you honor them, you get the reward of whatever it be, allowance or cake or a trip out or whatever.
Okay, yeah, so you get some
lack of consequence.
Yeah, there you go. Lack of consequence. That's a good one. Yeah, lack of consequence. You get rewards. I don't know if you've ever...
You gained their trust.
Okay,
you had their trust. They trusted you.
There you go. You gain their trust. So maybe you're given more responsibility, maybe even more freedom in the future because you've gained their trust. Absolutely. All those are great things. I don't know if you've had the experience that I have had, but, there were times when I disobeyed and I thought my parents had no clue what they were talking about. I knew far better. I'm sure I'm the only one who ever thought that. And come to find out, shocking as it is, they knew what they were talking about. And as I think it was Lacey who was talking there, there were consequences. There were bad results and consequences, and not even necessarily from my parents. It could have been consequences from doing those things. They said, you should not do this. Don't do this. Don't do that. And I went out and did it, and I reaped the results of that, which were not good. And again, it may not have even come through my parents. So there's blessings when we honor, which again is more than just obey, but there's blessings in there. And when we were growing up, there would have been protection, wouldn't there? A lot of times people who are older, who are wiser, who have lived life, they have experiences, don't they? And we can gain a blessing from them. And this doesn't have to just stop with young children. This should continue throughout our life. We can look to people who have had experience, who have lived life in different ways, and they can tell us, listen, do it this way, don't do it that way. And if we learn from them, if we follow their advice, a lot of times we can gain the wisdom and not have to go through the experience they went through. And a lot of times those experiences are hardships, suffering, sorrows. We took the wrong turn in life. We did things the wrong way. Learn from my mistakes, and you'll be wiser for it. So there's definitely blessings that go even beyond just in childhood. I think one of the reasons why God has established within the assembly that there are meant to be elders, right, as the shepherds, and within the word elder clearly means they're older. They're meant to have life experience. There's meant to be wisdom there that they can present that wisdom. They can present their experiences and say, here's a better way. Here's a better path. We can learn from their experiences. Hopefully. And so the same thing would have been true when we were younger. All right. So what?
Yeah, James.
Yes, go for it. Go ahead.
Yeah, James. It's to me, I've seen this as a repeating cycle. As a young person, you'll have your parents that seems to you that they're not wise, that they don't understand. They're not very smart in the way that you think, that they don't know anything and that you know it all. And come later in life that you find out that it's you, it's not them that doesn't understand, that doesn't know anything, that they did know what they were talking about. And later in life, as you become parents yourself, your children, they come to find out that they, being children themselves, they are put into the same situation. Their parents, being you, don't know anything and that they know everything, and then it's a repetition. It just keeps going down the line. I lost my computer. But anyway, I thought that was, as we were talking about that, I can see that as a repetition. It seems to me that in my life that has just gone on and on.
Yeah, it can be, right. That you're right. There can be this cycle over and over again. We would want to grow and not to go through those cycles, or at least not go through them as many times as much as possible. We want to limit that kind of thing, and that means. And you make a good point. As we get older, we shouldn't then assume that we know everything anyways. We ought to be looking to those who are older, wiser, more mature, who have life experience, and trying to learn from them as well. And we could probably do that all the way through our lives. What instruction does God have for fathers? He mentions fathers in here. What does he say about that? What's he say to fathers?
Don't provoke your
Let's
children.
teach to the young.
All right, don't provoke. I think I heard you. Was that Paul? All right, yeah. Don't provoke your children to anger. Some translations might say to wrath or something along those lines. How is it that parents can frustrate their children or provoke their children to anger?
By not listening to them and really trying to find out where the child is coming from.
Okay, yeah, not listening. That could be a big one, right?
Telling
I've
them they're
known
not
that.
doing it right.
Say it again.
You're not telling them they're not doing it right, or nagging about the way that they are doing it.
Right, yeah, a nagging attitude. They might be doing what you'd ask them to do, but it's not perfect, right? It's it really is sufficient, but they're having trouble with it. Maybe they're, I don't know, folding the laundry a certain way. They're doing it. They're not trying to be rebellious, but we can be nitpicky on that aspect and really frustrate them. That might be something as a younger child could get frustrated. But absolutely, yeah, not listening to the children, nitpicking what they're doing, never finding it. It's never good enough. I don't know if you've had that experience. Anybody ever had the experience with their parents where you tried, just never good enough? Doesn't matter what you do. Can that be frustrating?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Can people give up? Like, why try? Why bother? I mean,
Yeah.
I think we'd say that's true, right?
I can't please them, so why do it? Try.
That's right. And you get so burnt out, you get so frustrated. It's kind of like, maybe it's like the parent who is wants their child to get, good grades in school, and they come home with a B plus, and the parent's not happy, and they get punished or they get reprimanded or because they didn't get an A. Like never good enough, never good enough. Doesn't matter how hard you try, it's just never good enough. That certainly can be frustrating. That can be upsetting. Why do you think Paul points out for fathers? Now, I mentioned parents. How can parents avoid frustrating their children? But Paul mentions specifically fathers, doesn't he?
Because they're leaders of the household.
Okay, he's the leader of the household. Yes, that's true. If we think about temperament, generally speaking, you think of mom as a lot of times, maybe not always, right? Won't be careful of generalizing too much, but a lot of times you think of mom as the one who's the the softer one, snuggly and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times the father is the authority figure, right? What's that old saying? Wait till your
father comes home.
Yeah, that's what that's the joke, right? But it's a joke for a reason. Wait till your father comes home. Not that mothers can't be, disciplinaries and all that, but so it may very well be that us fathers can actually be overbearing, can be too strong-handed. I don't think it's for just no reason that Paul points out fathers, don't frustrate your children. Don't provoke them to anger. I don't think it was for no reason. He didn't say mothers and fathers. He specifically pointed out fathers. And again, this goes back to the head of the household. In fact, in the Old Testament, God had commanded that fathers were to train the children up. A lot of times today we think of the mothers as training the young children, but the Old Testament, it talked about fathers doing that. And we got to be careful that, and of course mothers too, but we got to be careful that we don't so nitpick or have such high standards for our children or whatever it happens to be that they can never do anything good enough. They're never accepted, and that would frustrate them. And that could be a danger. We could get involved in that.
Also, sometimes parents want to pick the vocation for the child, where the child has no interest in that whatsoever, and that's very frustrating.
True. Yeah, absolutely. There, and maybe more so in other cultures. I don't know. It might be true in our culture as well. But I'm thinking about other cultures and ethnicities. A lot of times, the parents want the children to be doctors or lawyers or something like that, and they push them to get good grades and go to school and all that. And you'll hear stories of children as they grow up saying, I ended up becoming a poetry major. My dad wanted me to be an architect or a lawyer, but I just didn't want to do that. I wanted to sing songs or something along those lines. So yeah, professions, those kinds of things.
Some parents, I think, tend to maybe live through their children.
Okay.
Their main source of life seems to be centered around their children. And I don't know. I don't mean young children, but I mean forever and ever and ever. I mean,
Sure.
It seems like it's always the children, and what they're, that, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that can be frustrating too. Absolutely, absolutely. So we want to prevent, we want to avoid from doing that. So being cautious. So those of us who still have young children want to be careful that we don't, so nitpick things that they're never good enough. But of course, those of us who have older children want to be careful that we don't do the same thing. You're not raising your children right. You can see an adult parent, a parent doing that to an adult child, nitpicking or attacking them on, you're not doing this right. You're not doing that right. You should do this. You should do that. That could be frustrating as well for adult children. So we got to be careful.
Or trying to overparent the parent.
Right. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Trying to overparent the parent. Absolutely. They're not going to do it right. Let me parent for you. That can be frustrating.
The family, as God's put it down, is one of the most complicated institutions there is. And in order for us to get it right across all the facets, husband to wife and wife to husband and the children to parents, and even on to the household to the church and the church to the community, there has to be daily influential input from God into that household. And then, and I think it's significant in these passages that you're looking at that he speaks to the children before he speaks to he speaks to the children about obeying first, as opposed to flipping that around.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good point. Good point. And these relationships, as you had mentioned, these relationships go on into the rest of our lives. So it's not just within the home, right? The family is the unit, but that builds communities, that builds societies, and this goes and transcends or works its way into the church as well. It's a family unit within the church. Slightly different roles, but shepherds and elders are those older figures, and we're all brothers and sisters, right? There's that familial family type atmosphere even within the church. So a lot of these things that are talked about here should go with us through the rest of our lives and into the church and out into the world as well. So how is the Lord to be the center of the parent-child relationship?
I try with my girls when I'm teaching them lessons that, simple lessons, like be nice to the kid at school or to share your toys, that's the kind of Christian we should be, that shows that you love God and that God, that's what God wants us to do. Even the simple day-to-day things and even the normal things like praying before supper or when somebody's hurt or going in for surgery, how important prayer is. But even that the simple things that we do growing up, the things that they need to do at school, that those are ways to show that they are a child of God and that they need to be an example and, show people that they love God is by doing those simple things that people should be doing anyway. And I think that that's important.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Teaching them to be examples, right? Doing the things they need to do as examples to others. Oh, that's right. Very good. How else? How is the Lord the center of the parent-child relationship?
I think with frustration, we have to remember to seek God in prayer and, take time out for ourselves to calm ourselves before we frustrate our children with yelling them and nagging them and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This all revolves around the Lord, right? So we need to take time. And our brother Larry had mentioned that as well. And Lacey, you bring it back up again. It's very important that God has to be the center, right? Christ has to be the center of everything that we do. And so our lives should be full with experiencing God through his word and those kinds of things. So that we come in contact with God and that he is in the midst of all of our relationships, that he's the first thing, the primary source. He's our motivation, right? We talked about this at the beginning. So everything that a Christian does is focused as Christ being number one in their life, and then that's our motivation to do everything else. Now, if we forget that, let's say as parents, like you were saying, Lacey, if we forget that, or we don't take time to be in communion with God, then we can certainly act inappropriately. And of course, that can go the other way as well with children. We act inappropriately. We act the wrong way. We frustrate our children. Children don't obey their parents. And then, of course, the household breaks down. And then the household is the foundation of the community, and certainly the community of faith, the church. And then that affects the church, right? So we affect one another in all these areas. This goes back to what you were saying with children being examples. We are all examples. But if we don't have Christ as the center of our lives, if he is not in the midst of our parent-child relationship and our husband and wife relationship, which we talked about last week, and we're going to talk about in a second here, just briefly for a little bit, the relationships that go beyond that, then things are going to break down. Christ has to be the center of everything that we do. And that means we need to take time to understand and to listen to God, reading his word, dwelling on it, meditating. I'm reminded of the Old Testament when God tells the parents that as you are walking with your children, as you're going in, as you're coming out, as you're eating, as you're doing daily life, that you should be telling them about the Lord, that you should be telling them about the commands, you should be telling them. So we have an opportunity, and Jesus did that with his disciples. I mean, how did he teach? He went around and his disciples went with him and they lived life together. And of course, he would teach and preach and all that, but they lived life together. And so as we go through every day, there's an opportunity to teach our children about the Lord. You know, they did something wrong or right, or you know, we see something on the news, or they experience something and they come and they tell us about it. There's always this opportunity to live life together, but in the midst of God being the center of everything that we do. All right, so let's talk briefly. What did Paul say about slaves and their masters?
He talks about obedience to the masters.
Absolutely, talks about obedience. Slaves, be obedient to your masters. What about the masters?
Treat them like brothers.
Yeah, the masters have a role as well. Right. So, in fact, he says in like manner, he talks about the servants or the slaves, and then he says in like manner, the masters ought to, conduct themselves in a way that honors God, essentially, right? That there's this honoring of God that goes on with all of this. Now, what might a modern application of this slave-master relationship, what might that be?
A job.
Okay, a job. That's right. That's probably the closest that we in our Western culture would get, would be an employer and an employee kind of thing. The one thing that I would mention, though, is in the ancient world, you might be thinking, well, how did we get from the household to slaves and masters? Well, some of us may or may not know that slaves were part of the household. That's how it was in the ancient world, at least with a lot of slaves. They were part of the household. And so that's why this is part of what Paul is talking about. So that this is not 100%, right? This is not exactly equivalent to the employer and employee concept of today, but that would probably be the closest we have to what he's talking about there. But just keep in your mind when he talks about servants and masters, slaves and masters, that they would have been part of the same household. They wouldn't have been considered outside of the realm of the father and what that house was dealing with. So we haven't jumped to a whole different realm of life. We're still talking about the household unit. Now, for us today, again, this would be probably employer and employee kind of things. So how are Paul's instructions to slaves and masters an application of 5:21? Look back at chapter 5, verse 21. What's Paul say in 5:21?
Submit to one another.
Submit to one another. How is this an example of that?
Well, I'm having a little trouble with this, James, on the master part, because today our masters are generally not Christian.
Sometimes.
A lot of our masters today are not Christian. So,
yes.
And we can be asked to do things that are not right. So, and they can't be expected to treat us as unto the Lord. They have to be directed according to a code of ethics imposed upon them.
That's right. That's right. And, the same was true in the ancient world. Now Paul is dealing specifically, I think specifically with Christians, masters and slaves, that kind of thing. But it would still be applicable to, let's say, a slave who was a Christian, who was, owned by a non-Christian. I mean, Paul is still saying you still need to conduct yourself in a certain way. Now, if an employer today, just like a master back then, would have told or tells us to do something that goes against God's law, what do we do?
The same thing we do with our parents. We would obey God rather than the government.
That's right. We always default back to God is always first and foremost. Mm-hmm. And we talked about this in the marriage relationship. Wives are to submit to their own husbands in everything, it says, in the Lord in everything. But that excludes sinful behavior and things that are wicked, and so here the same thing would be the case. If a slave in the ancient world was a Christian and the master was not, well, he would still have an obligation to live like a Christ-like example to that master, not just when he's looking, but when he's not looking. And of course, that would exclude him doing sinful and wicked things. He would have to pay the consequences for following God rather than men. And we've seen examples of this in like the book of Daniel, where Daniel or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're willing to obey the laws and actually part of the government up until the government says do something that's against God's law, God's will. Then they say, we refuse to, and we'll just take the consequences because we're going to honor God first and foremost.
I think, James, considering those kinds of things calls upon us to do what Scripture says with counting the cost of discipleship. Because obeying God rather than man can have some stiff penalties on the worldly side. And we need to be prepared for that. We need to be prepared to step away in some instances. And I always like to think of it as, if God is allowing this to happen and you're being obedient and doing the things he's calling you to do, then he's got something better down the line anyway for
Amen.
you. So
yeah,
just have to, you'd have to persevere. You'd have to stand fast on Christ.
Yeah, that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. You said, there could be struggles. Like in the ancient world, again, I go back to the ancient world with slaves and masters. If your master tells you to do something sinful and wicked and you don't do it, well, you may very well be getting beaten for that, or who knows what. But ultimately, we serve Christ, and we're gonna follow his footsteps. But absolutely, counting the cost, it's difficult to be a Christian, and it's a lot easier just to go along with the world. And there's going to be times in our lives when the right thing to do is going to be the hardest thing to do. And it could cost you a lot, could cost you your job, could cost you money, could cost you whatever. The real question is, do we lose anything if we follow Christ?
No.
No loss at all.
No, there's no loss. Do we believe that, though? See, that's where the rubber meets the road. Within our Bible class, we can say, that's right, we don't lose anything. But the real test is when we're in the midst of it, and what do we do? What do we do? Do we believe it? And here's the thing that we need to be reminded over and over again. We lose nothing. We lose nothing. We gain. Every time we say yes to God and no to the world, we gain. When we say yes to what he commands us to do, when we do the hard thing, there's always blessing. May not be in the very moment, may not be the here and now, but this is something we have to grasp and grapple with, is that this world is not our home. There's bigger and better things. We're on our way to glory. There's something beyond this. So even if we don't see the fruit, the benefit, the blessing in following Christ for the short term, we lose nothing if we follow him in the long term. Now, we often receive blessings here and now. We talked about that, but not necessarily. But we got to look for eternity, not just for tomorrow. And that's difficult to do. I'm reminded, years ago, I was working with a congregation, and we ended up getting on the subject of giving to people. And as well as I do, there are people out there who take advantage of generosity. Is that right? Are there people out there that take advantage of generosity, abuse it, they don't need it, and they right. Now, I said, of course, we balance this with wisdom. If I know somebody is going to take the money that I give them and go buy heroin, I'm not going to give them the money, right? I mean, there's wisdom there. But what do I lose, right? If I give somebody money or I provide something for them and they abuse it, they do the wrong thing with it, and I've done it with a Christ-like attitude, serving Christ, have I lost anything?
No.
No, I haven't lost anything. They'll be held accountable for what they do, but I have lost nothing. So, I might provide for someone and find out later on that they abused that and they did something they shouldn't have with it, but I did it out of a motive of loving God and wanting to, do something for them in the name of Christ, give them a cup of cold water in Jesus' name, something along those lines. I haven't lost anything. And again, we got to be careful. If we know somebody's going to, right, somebody's going to do something bad with whatever we're going to give them, then we try to help them, but in a different way, maybe. But we don't lose anything. We don't lose anything. I think that's really the point. We got to have that eternal perspective in view and not just tomorrow. And that's hard to do. All right. So here's our homework question for today, and that is, how can you apply the truths that we've seen in this passage this week? How can we apply some of these truths? Now, we talked about a bunch of different things, but obedience and honor, parents and children, employer, employees, living the Christ-like life. How can you apply the truths, at least one or two of the things that we've looked at today? How can you apply that this week in your life? So I want you to think about that and try to put that into practice this week. And maybe it's in work. Maybe it's being obedient to your boss. Maybe we've struggled with that in the past, bucking the system or something. I don't know. Maybe it's in our relationship with our parents or with our children. Maybe we can grow with that. Maybe we've been those who have been too hard with our children. Maybe we need to reflect on that. Whatever it is, put into practice this week. All right. So any other thoughts or questions, comments before we wrap this up tonight?
Yeah, one other thought. Christians often talk about being disobedient to God in not following his instructions on giving to the poor and things like that. And they often find some kind of way to push back on what you've been talking about right here. But I've seen congregations and been a part of congregations where we actually put together care packages rather than money, and passed it on to those who were in need. And, sometimes it's appreciated, other times it's not. But beyond that, God is the one that gives the wisdom to do all of those kinds of things. So we need to seek his counsel in whatever it is we're going to do.
Amen. Absolutely. And you're right. That's a wise thing to do, is putting together little care packages, or, packages that have some daily essentials, things of that nature. Very, very good things to do. And I know of other congregations that have done such things as well. I think those are very, very useful, very good. Absolutely. Wisdom, and learning from other people as well, learning from other congregations, other otherwise members of the body who have experienced different things. Absolutely. Appreciate those words. Anybody else? Last thoughts?